I'm going to try to post some of these on recordings on YouTube. In fact, I've been working on that a bit, which might make them a little bit easier for you to review and understand. Which brings me to the next point. Thank you very much for your feedback on the questionnaire. I got a lot of a variety of feedback from they're not so difficult to, there's a lot of difficulty, things that stood out include maybe speaking too fast during the lecture, which I'll try to improve on, although I guess I have a lot of material to go over, so that makes it kind of hard, but I'll see what I can do. Another thing I heard was some of the terminology you don't understand, particularly the readings, but also in the lectures. So all I can say is I try to explain things like transaction costs and such that we're talking about in our last lecture, but also please raise your hand and let me know if there's a term you don't understand. Maybe we'll just start. We're going to finish up with liberalism today, and then we're going to start talking about constructivism, the third major paradigm of international relations. So reducing transaction costs, you can think of a transaction cost, just to review, as a type of, almost like a tesuyo or a cost of doing business. It can be, but it can be things like gathering information. You need to make a good decision, like if you want to buy a car, a used car, you want to know something about it. You might have to pay to have it checked out. That could be considered a transaction cost. Could be the transaction cost of sending money to somebody. You know, the fees you have to pay there. Those are just practical examples. But in terms of countries cooperating, say on trade, there are going to be various transaction costs in terms of, again, getting information, knowing who's honoring agreements, who's cheating, or just cobbling together an agreement that involves many different countries and many different actors. Just throw out a question, not in trade, but elsewhere. Can you guys think of something in the news recently in the last couple of days about a major international conference and major global negotiations that just concluded? Hope you guys are following the news. What's happened in the last couple of days? A big conference and a lot of give and take. I know you're going to start Googling, but anybody knows off the top of their head, that'd be better. What? G20, I guess there has been a G20, that's right, recently, but it's actually, in some ways, G20 is really important. This is even bigger, and in some ways, some would argue much more important than G20. It was taking place in Europe until about Sunday morning.
I'm not sure what it was called, but
yeah.
I think it was, I'm not sure what it was called, but I think it was about like reducing CO2 emissions.
That is exactly right. That was you, Jude, I guess. That's exactly right. It's about reducing CO2 emissions. Does anyone else want to chime in? Climate Change Summit, yes, COP26 held in Glasgow. And that's kind of, transaction costs and negotiation and issue linkage, and some of the stuff I talk about here can be illustrated with that conference, because like you have all kinds of different issues. Like on the one hand, you have all countries being asked to set targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then you have other things like poorer countries, less developed countries wanting money from richer countries, including Japan, by the way, to allow them to transition away from coal and oil and natural gas to, say, renewable energy. And are rich countries willing to pay for that? How much? And those things are being linked. So like countries like India are saying, well, we don't necessarily want to make an ambitious target unless we get some funding for making the transition, some help to make the transition. Less technical help at this point and more just a matter of funds for investment. Or funds for the compensation of the fact that sometimes fossil fuels are still cheaper than renewable energy, not always, but sometimes. Or another example, I mean, related to that would be, there was a push at the conference to, in Glasgow at this COP26 to call for the phase out of coal. And in the end, in part, a number of developing countries led by India said, no, we don't agree to that. And instead they went from phase out to phase down, which sounds like not a lot, but that again is linked to other issues that were being negotiated, such as India pointed out, well, developed countries continue to use a lot of oil and gas, and there's nothing in the COP agreement about phasing out oil and gas. So why should coal that we depend on be treated more strictly, was essentially what they're saying. But this international conference, you had a lot of trade-offs then. Oh, another trade-off you had was the issue of how to compensate countries that suffer a lot of damage from climate change. You have some countries like Tuvalu that are suffering a lot from climate change. Did you see if you watch TV, you might have seen the Prime Minister of Tuvalu with water up to here in the ocean giving a press conference. He was speaking on actually a concrete slab that it used to be a gun emplacement for the US military in Tuvalu in the South Pacific during World War II. It's now permanently underwater. It never used to be underwater. So he was illustrating the fact that his island, his nation is slowly disappearing. So what about compensation for those victims of climate change, countries that suffer, or developing countries that suffer famines or other costs from climate change? To what extent do emitters have to be responsible for paying for that? In some ways, nothing is a better illustration of international politics, international relations, and a borderless world than climate change, right? Because there's no border separating, Japan's air from South Korea's air or China's air. And the same is somewhat true with waters too. So in any case, just with that, I will now move on. We'll just finish up talking about the kind of neoliberalism I was talking about last time. And we will go on then to discuss constructivism. So transaction costs versus state interests. So a key question, and again, you're free to interrupt me if you want to. Just shout out. A key question is whether international regimes or institutions, again, practices around which actor expectations converge, whether these regimes or international institutions, such as the COP26, for example, by altering transaction costs can alter state behavior when regime rules conflict with a state's short-term myopic interests. So one challenge we can see recently was, well, actually, the examples come below, so I'll get to those in a moment. I'll give you some examples. But international regimes or institutions are less significant if they just reflect state interests. Even then, they're still significant, right? If they help states to realize their self-interest, mutual self-interest, they're still significant. But if they don't alter state behavior in any way, then they're less significant than they would be otherwise. Now, international institutions can also demonstrate their significance if states choose not to join them or to withdraw because they fear the influence of these institutions. For example, the president of the Philippines paid a backhanded compliment to the International Criminal Court when he had the Philippines withdraw from the court because the Philippines was starting to investigate him for massive human rights violations. So that's at least an indication that he had some fear that they might be effective and that he could find himself being prosecuted. Now let's look at some examples of this issue of transaction costs versus state interests. So in other words, what transaction costs are saying here is that institutions make some transactions cheaper than others. And for example, the International Criminal Court makes it easier, because it exists as an institution, to prosecute people, including state leaders, who may commit massive human rights violations. Whereas before you needed an international You needed the UN to pass a resolution. You need to set up a special court. You need to do all kinds of things to do that. Now you have the court that's there, it's existing, it's all ready to go. So it's a lot cheaper and easier to do that than it was in the past. But to take some other examples, the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord during the Trump administration. So that's the US withdrawing from an international regime or institution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in that case, you could argue that this institution was not effective in preventing the US or Trump from pursuing what he saw as America's myopic short-term self-interest. On the other hand, you think about the legitimacy, which we'll talk more about under constructivism, or the strength of the COP system and the Paris Climate Accord. After Trump was defeated last year, the US went back in. So you could see the US leaving the Paris Climate Accord as signaling it doesn't have the ability to influence the United States, but then the US comes back in. So maybe it actually does in the longer run. We debate that. US non-participation in the UN Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. I think, let's see, that's Kokuren no Kayoho, I think. Joyaku, I have to check that. Or the International Criminal Court. The US does not participate in either of those. Now, again, you could say the US does not participate in the International Criminal Court because, as the US has said quite openly, it's worried that some of its citizens might be put on trial as a result. Now, the US says that it's not necessarily a fair court, so you can take that as, interpret that as you will. But also the US is not participating in UNCLOS. Another example was the Trump administration's attempts to frankly sabotage the World Trade Organization when they refused to approve the appointment of new judges to arbitrate trade disputes among countries. That caused the arbitration system to briefly break down and reflected the fact that the Trump administration, Trump in particular, believed that the WTO did not work in America's interest. So again, this is the US trying to get out of an international institution because it doesn't serve its short-term interests. Another example might be Japan's decision recently to pull out of the International Whaling Commission and to resume commercial whaling. There again, instead of getting Japan to change its behavior, although the IWC did succeed in partially changing Japan's behavior for a couple of decades, when Japan only did so-called limited scientific whaling, although it was really for commercial purposes. Japan's decision to withdraw, again, could suggest that, again, this institution was ineffective in terms of changing or influencing Japan's behavior. Finally, China's refusal to participate in the UNCLOS court case at the Court of Arbitration in The Hague brought against it in the South China Sea by the Philippines is another case that indicates the limits of UNCLOS to influence, in this case, China's behavior in the South China Sea. So these are some negative examples, but again, there are also other examples where states do decide to abide by these international institutions. So for another example off the top of my head, you had a dispute in the 1970s between Iceland and the UK over fishing rights, but eventually the legitimacy and strength of UNCLOS and its institution of giving every state 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone EEZ caused the British to back down against Iceland, even though the British were much stronger. There are some other reasons too, but that's one to keep in mind. Okay, the information functions of regimes are arguably the most important. They help to solve problems of asymmetrical or unequal information, moral hazard, and irresponsibility. Well, so let's take the example of asymmetrical information. And by the way, I mentioned this last week, but when you think about all these functions of institutions, another way to think about them is in terms of, again, internet platforms. I mentioned Airbnb, which I think you all are familiar with, and how that solves a lot of, that Airbnb helps to reduce transaction costs because it provides information Also helps to overcome asymmetrical information. It may even help with moral hazard and irresponsibility, perhaps. But let's take asymmetrical information for an example. And by the way, these things I'm talking about are not only useful for understanding how states cooperate through international institutions, they're also basic concepts that you'll find useful in economics as well. So let's take an example, and Cohen in particular is borrowing a lot from economics in terms of arguing, making the case for international institutions. So let's take asymmetrical information. Who here has heard of the market for lemons? The marketplace for lemons. Anyone know what a lemon is? I mean, not literally the fruit, but what is a lemon as like a metaphor? Have any of you ever bought a used car? No. Have you ever thought about, you have? Could you speak up a little bit? Yes. That's right. And that, of course, plays out in the used car market a lot. That's exactly right. So in the market for lemons, the seller has more information about what they're selling than the buyer has about what they're buying. This is particularly true for a complex. Now, if it's actually a literal lemon or a piece of fruit, you can look at it and judge pretty easily. But if it's a car, you as the seller know a lot about the history of the car, what it's been through, if it's had any accidents, what kind of repairs it's needed, if it's reliable. But the buyer doesn't know that. Now you will try to present a car as a cream puff. So actually it's sometimes called the market for lemons versus cream puffs. So a cream puff means a really wonderful car, a great car, right? And you, even if you have a lemon, you have an incentive to essentially to lie and to claim your lemon is actually a cream puff to get a higher price, right? But because buyers know this, and buyers know that you have an incentive to misrepresent your car and make it seem better than it is, well, buyers will not believe any cream puff claims, which means that essentially buyers will come to the market assuming every car is a lemon, and they will only pay lemon prices. They will not pay higher cream puff prices. So what does that do? That drives all the cream puffs out of the market, right? Because no one's willing to pay for a cream puff because they don't know if it's a cream puff. They're only willing to pay the lower price assuming it's a lemon. So if I have a cream puff, I'm not going to accept a lemon price. I'm going to withhold my car from the market. So that means that as a result of this, all the cars in the used car market end up being lemons, right? Unless you solve this problem. Now, you can solve this by going to a third party that might do a third party inspection. There are ways you can solve this, but that's what this market is about. And that's something else international institutions do. They help to provide information to overcome these asymmetries. Regimes can help solve this problem by providing standards of behavior against which a state's performance can be measured and its reputation for honoring or not honoring agreements can be established. So like I mentioned the WTO that Trump was trying to sabotage. It will, states can bring suits against each other. So Japan and Korea have brought suits against each other, the US and Japan against each other, US and EU, etc. And you have a court of arbitration or a arbitration panel in the WTO that will decide who is violating WTO rules and who is not. And that becomes public knowledge. That can give you a bad reputation for not honoring the WTO. It also means the other party then has the right to impose countervailing tariffs, retaliatory tariffs against you, and you do not have the right to retaliate against those. So, but by establishing standards, clear standards, and providing information, we know which countries honor their agreements and which do not. And it provides standards for measuring state performance and how much they honor their agreements. So again, let's go back to COP26. Under the Paris Climate Agreement, all states have to set plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So Japan, for example, said it would cut greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030, which, by the way, is really ambitious, and would reach carbon neutrality by 2050, right? So in 2030, we can go and see, well, did Japan fulfill this or not? The EU promised, I think, 50% by 2030. Did they fulfill that or not? US was like 40%, I think. So, by forcing countries to set clear standards and targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing renewable energy use, phasing down coal, etc., this provides standards, benchmarks, information that can then be used to see if other states are honoring these agreements. And this is really important too, because you have something called the collective action problem, right? Which is that states might be tempted to basically free ride off the efforts of others, say, well, other countries will do this, we don't need to, or other countries are going to cheat, so we can cheat too, right? But if you have the information provided, you know who's cheating and who isn't, who's honoring their agreements and who isn't. And that makes it easier to force everyone to cooperate and nobody to cheat. Because they can't really kind of do that in secret or say, well, others are cheating, so we can do it too. So moral hazard. What is moral hazard? Well, fire, as it says, I wrote there, if you have fire insurance on your house, right? Probably most of you have never bought insurance. As you get older, you get wealthier and you buy houses and cars, you're going to have to buy insurance. But if you buy fire insurance or auto insurance, it might encourage you to drive faster if you buy auto insurance, good auto insurance. And fire insurance might encourage you to be less careful about fire risk because if your house burns down or you have an accident, it's not a total loss. Part or most of your loss will be covered by the insurance company. So that's what's known as moral hazard. It encourages you to take more risks and it's something that encourages you to maybe take more risks, to engage in more risk-seeking behavior, and to be less risk averse. So to be less careful with fire, less careful with driving. Now, irresponsibility involves states or people might enter into agreements assuming the continuation of a benign environment. So they might enter into an agreement or make a commitment without really assessing, whether they can fully carry it out under all circumstances. So after the 3/11 earthquake, the Great East Japan earthquake, Japan abandoned its greenhouse gas reduction commitments made under the Kyoto Protocol because of that. There's also a self-selection problem. So people with higher risks for heart disease are more likely to purchase life insurance, for example. Countries that gain the most and pay the least from cooperation are the most likely to want to join, whereas those who have to pay more are less likely to join. So for example, poorer states, like states in Eastern Europe that are less well off economically, were very enthusiastic about joining the European Union because they would get a lot of money from the EU for development projects in countries like, say, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. And they weren't very wealthy, so they wouldn't have to pay much in tax to the EU. On the other hand, Norway, where I used to live, has never joined the EU, partly because it's extremely wealthy. They have a lot of oil revenue, and they know that they would pay more. They'd also have problems with fisheries and some other problems. But that could be an example of moral hazard for the EU. So the poor countries that gain the most and pay the least are more enthusiastic about joining than are the richer ones who would pay more. Now, international regimes can monitor actors' behavior and mitigate the problems of moral hazard. They can point out if states are not being prudent, if they're doing things that run, say, the risk of a recession or of a currency crisis, like when you overvalue your currency and you end up in a recession or a currency crisis. And like say Greece fell into about 10 years ago. Also, issue linkage within regimes raises the cost of deception and irresponsibility, since these behaviors can have broader costs for the state in other areas. So issue linkage. So one thing, again, if we look at climate that's being issued, that's where we're seeing issue linkage beginning to be created, is climate and trade. So essentially what the EU is talking about, a climate tax. So if, for example, they think China is not, or Japan or somebody else is not serious about, is not taking the steps to cut their greenhouse gas emissions, and their targets are very unambitious, and their implementation of those goals is very weak, they will impose a tariff on imports from those countries to compensate for that fact. It's also a way to so-called equalize the playing field in trade, because countries that do more to reduce greenhouse gas reductions quicker, their companies may pay more, whereas countries and companies that don't do much may get an economic advantage. So they link trade to greenhouse gas reductions by potentially imposing tariffs on countries that are slow to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's an example of issue linkage. That has not come up in COP25 so far, but what has come up in COP25 for climate change is linking developing countries' reductions of greenhouse gases with money being invested by developed countries, aid from developed countries to help developing countries switch to renewable energy. Now, international regimes can make cooperation easier by lowering the risk of being double-crossed, of cheating, reducing uncertainty, making state actions conform to predictable patterns. And international regimes are useful for governments, not threats to their autonomy. That's kind of the bottom line. So again, when we started off talking about liberals and international institutions around the time of World War I 100 years ago, was how can we use international institutions and organizations to create world peace and punish countries that commit aggression and punish lawbreakers, you know, and basically be a government over states. But this conception of neorealism, of neoliberalism that's developed in recent decades is not about that. It's not that ambitious. But still, the point is they matter. They facilitate cooperation and agreements among states, especially when states have an interest in doing so. And as we were talking about earlier with, say, Rousseau's stag hunt, sometimes even when two states have an interest in cooperation, two or more states, it might still be hard to realize that because they might have an interest in defecting for short-term gain, or they might not believe the other side really wants to cooperate. So states help to overcome the problems that get in the way of states who want to cooperate. So then in conclusions, the three sides of the Kantian triangle are democracy, economic interdependence, and international institutions. This presentation I just am finishing now is focused on interdependence, solo y son, and international institutions. Classic liberals believed economic interdependence reduced incentives for war and made war thereby less likely. World War I tended to discredit this optimism. Cohen and Nye by the 1970s are now partially resurrecting the concept with complex interdependence, arguing that economic interdependence plus other forms of interdependence like social interdependence, political interdependence, make the use of force more difficult and reduce the centrality of military force in relations among states. Now, World War I also encouraged liberals to emphasize the development of international institutions as a means to prevent war. Failures of the League of Nations, Kokusai Renmei, and the international, and later the United Nations after World War II, Kokusai no Rengo, raise doubts about the ability of international institutions to do this. Yeah, international institutions might nonetheless have been effective in preventing some conflicts by facilitating communication and reducing misperceptions, and perhaps by modifying some state interests in a more cooperative direction over time. When international institutions have that effect, it's hard for us to know because we're talking about things that don't happen, right? So for example, in Europe in the 1970s, a whole series of a new organization, the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe was created. They put in all these confidence building measures and things that were designed and military exchanges to reduce misperception between the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union and NATO led by the United States. And you had no war. Now, was it because of those confidence building measures, or would there have been no war anyway? Hard to know. But we can certainly argue that the two sides had more accurate perceptions of the other side in terms of their military posture, their doctrine, and all that sort of thing, that may have contributed to making the risk of accidental war less. And also, perhaps, over time, participation in international institutions can cause states' interests to change, can cause states to redefine their interests and redefine their interests in a more cooperative direction over time. Another example I'm familiar with, when China joined initially the United Nations, and when they joined multilateral institutions in East Asia, like the ASEAN Regional Forum, China was initially very cautious and skeptical. China tended to see the UN and these other multilateral institutions as ways that the US and other countries would use these multilateral institutions to try to constrain and contain China, or control balance against China and limit its freedom of action in foreign policy. But over time, China became much more enthusiastic towards both the United Nations and, say, regional security cooperation in East Asia. China became the most active of the 5 permanent Security Council member states in United Nations peacekeeping, for example, which is kind of surprising. So China became much more activist in the UN. It became much more activist in the ARF. And essentially, China transitioned from seeing multilateral institutions as things Western countries use to constrain them, to seeing them as multilateral, as institutions Japan or that China could possibly use to constrain the US and others. So they developed a different view of these institutions and became much more interested in using them for their own purposes. They also saw things like peacekeeping as a substitute for, say, American military, UN peacekeeping as a substitute for, say, American military intervention. Okay, so more generally, but these international institutions have been effective in security, in terms of international security to some extent, but they've also been effective, perhaps more effective, in trade, finance, and other forms of economic cooperation among states. Okay. Any questions about this? I know there's a lot of complicated terminology in this presentation, particularly talking about neoliberal institutionalism. I will not, on quizzes, get into too much detail on this, but these are also useful concepts to know, again, for studying economics, international institutions in general. And again, they can even help you kind of understand how a lot of the value that a lot of internet platforms, again, like Airbnb have. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, then I'll move on. So we're next going to start talking about constructivism. So let me just switch presentations here. So this is based on the readings, the first reading of two readings for Constructivism. One is this by Ted Hopf. This is kind of a comprehensive overview, and then the other one by Alex Wendt, which we'll read later, is more about kind of more focused on anarchy and international politics. But any case. So, and we're going to start with a discussion group question, in the hopes that you've had a chance to try to look at the constructivist reading at Hopf, if not at Wendt, and that you have some thoughts about it already. Again, these are your initial thoughts that I want you to discuss, and then see how our discussion rolls out after that. So this is a question I want you to look at. It's a bit long. Take a minute to write it down. Is the international anarchy that states find themselves in the result of the distribution of material capabilities, or is it a social construction? Socially constructed. To take a smaller example, does a tank, like, Senshaw, military tank, does it have an objective meaning, or does it only take on meaning within a social context? That's kind of a smaller example of that's the same question asked on a smaller scale. So by the distribution of material capabilities, realism and liberalism we've talked about up to now are focused on material goods. They're focused on economic output, as in planes and houses and roads and food and all kinds of things. Or, in the case of realism, they focus a lot on military power, again, tanks or nuclear weapons or ships or other things like that. A realist like Thucydides will focus on the material capabilities that Athens had to destroy Milos, for example. Whereas 19th century liberals would focus on the material gains from free trade and how that makes everyone wealthier and healthier and more content, and therefore supposedly less inclined towards war. But this is asking you to think about whether, it's these material things that states have and use that matter, or whether it's the way in which these are understood through social construction, through socially agreed meanings about ideas about what these mean. Okay, so that's the question. I will now stop sharing. I'll after you enter the group again, I'll put it back up on the screen here anyway. Those of you at home won't be able to see that. Yeah, and those of you who are here, again, these are mixed. We're going to have to do, again, mixed groups. Zoom people just on Zoom, and people here online, and people here in person. So it's probably good for everyone to be online, so that you can talk to the people in your group who are also who are just participating online. Okay.